Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining in. It's good to see you. Just a public service announcement before we begin. We'll be on break after this session and this shiur tonight, and back in 3 weeks. So for better or worse, I am off to Vietnam and Cambodia. Did not really want to go to Vietnam the first time, but have no choice now but to be on this river cruise in Vietnam and Cambodia. So I don't know if I'll have any Wi-Fi there or the times will work out. So we'll be back and we'll keep everybody informed if you're on the WhatsApp group, certainly, and also in the Parsha sheet. So welcome here. We're going to dedicate this year to Yaakov Abba ben Yisrael Eliyahu J. Friedman of blessed memory. His funeral was yesterday. He was a very special individual from Ra'anana, and we had a close relationship with him over many, many years. So it should be a zchut, a aliyat neshama for him. We're going to talk a very, very fascinating story tonight, again, centering on two personalities who are a little bit in the sidelights, in the shadows, but very, very important. And we'll get there in a moment. Let me say first, and we've said this before, that the Torah is a Torah of truth, Torah emet. Moshe emet, Torah to emet. The Torah tells the truth. And sometimes that truth is not all that pretty. And it sometimes casts people in a fairly negative light, but that's life. The Torah is about human beings. These are not angels. These are human beings. They make mistakes. They have their faults and their failings, even though they are great people who we emulate and we look up to, but they have their moments also when perhaps they have to do their own tikkun. So we're going to talk about in this Parsha of Vayeshev, the saga, beginning of the saga of Yosef, and in particular, the connection between Yosef and Yehuda. These are two giant figures in Jewish life, without any question. Yehuda is the king. Yehuda is the ancestor of Moshiach. Yehuda is the strongest of the brothers. He is, in a way, the Bechor, but Yosef is the other firstborn. And Yosef, in his own right, he is also a great individual whose lineage goes through history. We see Yosef and Yehuda often in conflict. We'll see it at the pit, where Yosef they make this very tragic, fateful decision to sell Yosef into slavery. Yehuda is there. Yehuda tries to help somewhat, but in the end of the day, interestingly enough, the brothers say, had you, Yehuda, stood up for Yosef, even if all the rest of us were against you, you would have succeeded in saving him because you're stronger than anybody else. And in a sense, they blame Yehuda when they get involved in the blame game. So they're together at the pit. They stand and face one another in Egypt at this dramatic moment when Yehuda stands up to Yosef, that's coming to the end of this story, and says, I will not forsake and desert Binyamin, and basically is prepared to do war with Yosef, the viceroy of Egypt, whom he does not recognize. And we see them also later in history when the two will head their own kingdoms. Yehuda, of course, will be the Melech and his descendants of Malchut Yehuda, and it will be Yosef and others, but primarily Yosef, who will be the head of Malchei Yisrael. The first king, of course, also comes from Yosef. Shaul comes from Binyamin, and Ephraim is always representative of Malchei Yisrael and the 10 lost tribes. So they come in conflict. And this Parsha is telling us the kind of, you might say, the growing up, the maturation of both Yehuda and Yosef. Even though Yehuda certainly is much older than Yosef, Yosef's only 17 at the time that he is taken into captivity. But it's a remarkable parsha that is a counterpoint between Yehuda and Yosef, trying to show us, to some extent, their failings and foibles and how they deal with it, which is going to really be a lesson in morality for Am Yisrael. And it's not always a pretty picture, because both have very basic instincts. Not to reference the movie Basic Instinct, but it connects to it, as we'll see, for those who remember that movie. And it begins with the descent of Yehuda from a position of, I would say, moral superiority to one of moral failing. The pasuk says, "Vayehi ba'etahi, vayered Yehuda me'et achav." Yehuda goes down, and Rashi says right there on the spot that this is a reference going down to declining in his moral behavior. What happens here is a very convoluted story, but we'll try to go through it a bit. Yehuda is going to act in, I would say, a rather non-kingly manner. First of all, he sets his sights on an unnamed Canaanite girl. Now, you know the Canaanim are not held in high regard whatsoever by the Jewish people. They're a cursed people. Remember, we said that Abraham didn't want Eliezer as a mechutin because he said to him, you're a cursed, ACC, URSED, because you're a Canaanite. Nevertheless, Yehuda is going to have this relationship with a Canaanite girl. We don't know her name. We know the name of her father, but not her name, interestingly enough. But apparently he falls for her. What Elaine would say, if you don't mind the expression, shik's appeal. And this is what Yehuda goes for. And they have 3 sons together, Onan, and Shelah. Well, marries Tamar. We only see her name later, but he marries Tamar, but he refuses to impregnate her, basically because he feels that she's a gorgeous girl, and why ruin a beautiful figure? This is an idea left over from a time even before Abraham. And when they talk about the fact that there were beauty wives and birth wives, the birth wives were the ones who were constantly getting pregnant and obviously difficult to maintain their figure. And the beauty wives were the ones that the husbands kind of kept around, the showpieces, the perfect figure women. And it's actually Sarah who comes along to dispel that motif of having the 2 women by saying, you can be beautiful and pregnant as well. And so when the other women told her, why are you always praying to have a child? You'll lose your figure. Sarah says, listen, having children is one of the most important things you can do. And it doesn't mean I will be any less beautiful. And indeed, after she has Yitzchak, she retains her beauty. In any case, first of all, he will not impregnate her. You might say commits an error, and he is struck down and killed. He dies. So comes along his brother in this idea of yibum, of marrying the brothers, the deceased brother's widow, if they haven't had a child, to maintain the lineage. And that is going to go to the brother Onan, but he refuses as well for the same reason. And Onan, his name becomes connected, excuse me, with this this sin of onanism, of what we call in Hebrew shichvat zera lashav, spilling the seed and not using it to impregnate. And so he is also struck down. So then there is a 3rd son, Shelah. And Yehuda says, well, wait for him to grow up, he says to Tamar, and you can marry him. There's a lot of discussion as to why Yehuda did not give his blessing to a marriage with Shelah and Tamar. Some say it was because he was afraid 2 of my sons died already as a result of this woman. I don't want a third. That would make her what we call in Hebrew a katlanit, that someone who kills multiple husbands. But others say that it wasn't such a pure motive. In any case, years go by, Tamar waits, but realizes this is not going to happen. And she has to make a decision. What is she going to do? Yehuda's wife dies. And since it's hard for a man to be left without a woman, he seeks out a prostitute. Tamar senses that she is destined to bear a child to this family. So she disguises herself as a prostitute, and she seduces Yehuda in return for the promise of a goat. And as security, she takes his signet ring, his cane, and his cloak. And then they make this deal and they have relations. Now, of course, when we think about this, the question that immediately comes to mind is, how does somebody of such stature as Yehuda go seeking a prostitute? And indeed, it's not an easy thing to explain. Art Scroll in classic form struggles mightily to try to reconcile this idea of the Avot, Imahot, and the royal family of the Jewish people being totally sinless, but it really doesn't go over well. I'm going to read you a medrash that the Art Scroll brings down, and I know if Susie's listening, she's not going to like it, but the medrash says, quotes Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, Yehuda sought to pass by Tamar, who again was disguised. He did not realize it was his daughter-in-law. The Holy One, blessed be he, dispatched the angel of lust to trap Yehuda. The angel said to Yehuda, where are you going? From where will kings arise? From where will great people arise? Only then Yehuda detoured to see her by the road. He was coerced against his good sense. Okay, if you want to accept that, you're welcome to. But I think it's clear to say that Yehuda was, after all, a man. And I think and this is what we started with, that it says Yehuda went down. He gave into his baser instincts. And even though the Art Scroll wants to say this is before the Torah was given, prostitution was not looked down as much as it would be later. I'll let you think about that yourself. Well, Tamar disappears, and she never does get her goat, so to speak. And she reappears only when she is 3 months pregnant. Yehuda, somewhat inexplicably, when notified that his daughter-in-law was pregnant, and he wasn't aware that she had relations with any legal relations, calls for Tamar to none other than to be set on fire and burned alive. Maybe that punishment, which it remains an open question, what crime did she do that would incur the death penalty? It wasn't as if she was married and in committing adultery. And that is a question that really is the Meforshim struggle to try to answer. But maybe this idea of being burned alive was a kind of mita keneged mita punishment for, it appears to be her illegitimate passion. But soon we see it wasn't illegitimate. And Tamar doesn't immediately implicate Yehuda in being the father, but sends Yehuda the items that he had given her when they met on the road. And Yehuda then admits, he tzidka mimeni, she is more righteous than I. Of course, she is saved, and she will have twins. And again, these twins will be related in two ways to Yehuda, which is another issue. And the twins will be named Zerach, is actually my paternal grandfather's name, and Peretz. Peretz will be the ancestor of David and Moshiach. So that's this rather shady and difficult story about Yehuda. At least in the end, Yehuda somewhat, I would say, redeems himself by admitting, he tzidka mimeni, before Am and Edah, before the people, I was wrong. She's blameless, and Yehuda has to take his lumps, which is, at least when you start to admit that you're not perfect, that's the start of redemption. And certainly it is for Yehuda. In the same Parsha, we have a second story that now is going to interplay the progression, the maturation of Yosef. Yosef is in Egypt. He has been sold a number of times, ultimately sold to the Arabs, the Ishmaelim, and then he is put into the home of Potiphar, who is a very, very rich man. You might say he is I have to use the right language here, he is a house Jew, let's call it that. And he's put there to kind of run things in the house, and he quickly makes his mark. And everything he does is successful. And as we'll see, he has a great charisma, and he is elevated by Potiphar to basically run his estate. Potiphar is a very, very wealthy person. He is one of the, there's different opinions as to who he was. He might have been even the chief executioner. Others say he was the captain of the guard. In any case, he's a prominent person. He has a wife. Now, she is not identified anywhere by name. However, I will tell you that later authorities identify her as Zuleika. That's her name. Zuleika, it's kind of a strange name, but Chazal say that's what her name was, Zuleika. You like her, you like her. Anyway, she clearly has a thing for Yosef. Yosef is drop dead gorgeous. The Torah goes in many places to talk about how beautiful he is. Even in the bracha that will be given by Yaakov of Yosef, he makes a very strange, unusual statement saying the girls climbed the walls in order to get a glimpse of Yosef. So gorgeous was he. 17 years old, curly black hair. I always, when I think, get a picture in my mind of Yosef, and I'm dating myself, it's even before my time. Some of you who remember, I just get this picture of Ed Cookie Burns in 77 Sunset Strip. You can Google that. There's even a song, how gorgeous he was. And he was always with his combing his hair. And so Yosef is definitely a good looking young man. And she goes for him in a big way. It's interesting. This is a very funny but great story in Sefer HaYashar that says that Zuleika, we'll call her that by name because that was her name, she was mocked by the other aristocratic Egyptian ladies. Remember, she's married to a very wealthy man. She's an aristocrat. And she's mocked by her friends, I guess the Mahjong ladies, and they're making fun of her because she's infatuated with this Hebrew slave boy. So she invites her friends to her home. She gives them all oranges and knives to slice through the oranges to eat. And while they're engaged in slicing the oranges, Zuleika has Yosef walk through the room. Distracted by how handsome he is, all the ladies accidentally cut themselves with knives and draw blood. And they look up and their hands are bloody. And Zuleika reminds her and says, listen, you're just seeing him once walk through the room. I've got to see him every day. Can you imagine what it is to live with somebody this gorgeous? And the Sefer Yashar says, following that, nobody mocked her anymore. In any case, she continually tries to seduce him. And she, although the Torah only hints to this, nevertheless, it says, the pasuk says that one day he comes in. Let me find the pasuk. Hang on a second. She speaks to him day after day, and then one day, he comes to do his business. And to do his business, Rashi quotes and says that essentially he had decided, you know what, I can't hold out anymore. I'm going to have to give in to her seduction, and I'm going to have relations with her. But then in this famous statement, he sees the face of his father. Some want to say that Yosef actually looked very much like Yaakov. So he looked in a window or maybe in a pool, and he saw his reflection. And when he saw the face of Yaakov, so he said to himself, how can I do this to my father? How can I do something like this that will, if my father would find out, what he would think of me? So basically, he says, I've got to run away. I've got to get away. She grabs at his garment and he lets her have it. In this case, the cloak, the garment, whatever he's wearing, and he runs out. She may have feared that he would tell her husband that she was after him. So some want to suggest she wanted to hurry to be the first to accuse Yosef of attempted rape. And say to him, your slave did things like this to me. This is also in her statement. It's also a little bit only under kind of hinted at in the text. And she says, Ba'alai ha'eved ha'ivri, he came litzachek bi, which is another euphemism for saying to have sex with me. And even more so, to say that she uses this kind of hint to say, to do things like this to me. So Rashi says, what did it mean, things like this? Well, to engage in all kinds of different sexual positions. So she really pours it on and says, he's the one. He wanted to have sex with me. Not that I wanted to do it. He's just, after all, a Hebrew slave, etc. All this to try to anger Potiphar. I find it very fascinating in today's day and age, in the Me Too generation. This is reverse sexual abuse, that women are not always on the receiving end. Sometimes some men are also the ones who are being sexually abused. And I guess they would say, hey, me too. It's not only the women. I'm sure that there are some men out there right now, present company excluded, who have to constantly fight off women, but it can be very exhausting. And this is, it's interesting in today's day and age that you're talking about a situation that's very much the reverse of what normally happens. In any case, Yosef is not executed. Now, you would think that if this highfalutin wife of a very important dignitary in Egypt accuses this Hebrew slave yet of sexual abuse and rape, and especially the way she embellishes it, you would think he would be executed. But Yosef is not executed. So the commentaries try to understand why not. So first of all, you have to understand Potiphar, according to the Mefarshim, was a eunuch. So eunuchs often, right, this is someone who was unable to have sexual relations. So they often had high positions in many civilizations, either because they were playmates of the royalty, which often was gay, especially you see this, that homosexuality was rampant, for example, in Rome and other civilizations, or because perhaps they were safe. In other words, there was no danger of them impregnating any of the harem that the royalty had. So they often chose these eunuchs to be in high positions. I remember when I was in China and went to the Forbidden City in Beijing. So they talked about, the guide said that the only men who were allowed to sleep within the walls of the forbidden city and enter it at night were eunuchs who could not impregnate any members of the harem, so that if they ever got pregnant, they would know that they were getting pregnant via the king and they had royal blood, not that some non-royal was impregnating them. So if they wanted to, it was a privileged position, but in order to get it, they essentially had to be castrated. So it was one of those good news, bad news. The good news is you're going to be sleeping in the walls of the palace in the Forbidden City tonight. The bad news is you're going to be sleeping in the walls of the Forbidden City because you now are becoming a eunuch, and that's what the kings would do. So that, what we're told, that was Potiphar. So he knew his wife was frustrated sexually and could very well have been the abuser in this case. So he suspected that Yosef may not have been guilty, even though his wife said he did what he did. He also was someone that Potiphar liked a great deal. He really liked Yosef. Yosef had done very well for him. And indeed, the pasuk says, Vayet elav chesed, vayetein chino, that God gave him chesed and let's say chino means chen, that he was very likable, but chesed is translated as a kind of charisma there. It doesn't mean there, we say when we talk about a bride, right, we use the expression kala na'a b'chasida. It actually means pretty, and she has a certain charisma, certain personality. And that's exactly what Yosef had. So Potiphar probably did not want to do away with him. All of this leads to Yosef being sent to the dungeon, where he will meet the baker and the butler and begin his ascent to viceroy of Egypt. So all of this, this story, this very convoluted but fascinating story, ultimately it leads to the path where Yosef will become the viceroy. Rashi has a very interesting comment. Rashi says that the wife of Potiphar, this woman we've been talking about, Zuleika, there was something, even though she did what she did, she informed on Yosef with a false report about what he did and could have gotten him killed. But there's another side to her too. She saw, say the rabbis, through astrological signs that she would have children through Yosef. So she felt, I am meant for Yosef. My husband can't give me any children. He's a eunuch. So this is something that I feel has to happen. But the astrological signs, the calculations were slightly off. This is what we call in Aramaic, aspaklaria lo me'ira. You see something and there's something to what you're seeing, but you don't quite get it right. In this case, Asnat, who would marry Yosef? He would be married with Asnat. And Asnat was actually the daughter, according to the rabbis, by adoption of Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar, Zuleika. So what would happen is Asnat would become the wife of Yosef. So the wife of Potiphar, she would in the end beget grandchildren, not children, through Yosef, right? She was the step grandmother. It wasn't really, right? We talked about that. This is what happened with Dinah. When Dinah was impregnated by Shechem, so she ran away. This child was given up for adoption. And this was the child that Shechem and Dinah produced, who would be adopted by Potiphar and his wife, and who ultimately would marry Yosef. So somehow she saw, I'm connected to Yosef. But of course, it wasn't exactly as she saw it. So these two seductresses here of Tamar and Mrs. Zuleika Potiphar, they're quite fascinating. Zuleika had good intentions, some good intentions at least, and she actually would become the step grandmother of Ephraim and Manasseh. So she plays a part in this drama. but it's very, very, in a very convoluted and mystical and kind of non-holy way. Tamar, for her part, is a Canaanite woman, someone who normally would never be part of the royal family, would be banned by marriage to a Jew, and yet she will become the ancestress of Moshiach, and her name will be quite popular to this day. We name girls Tamar, right? Susie and I have a good friend, and Janice and other people here, and Beth, of Tamar. She's a lovely person, and she has a good name. And we say sometimes, okay, adoptive grandmother. I see the correction there. Thank you. But we say about her, Tzaddik katamar yifrach. A holy person like Tamar will bloom, in a sense, and will give rise to holy people. And this is the twisted, mysterious, murky makings of Moshiach in Jewish history. And it's all here in these kind of sordid stories that show us people are real, that they go through all kinds of trying, testing situations in life, and they have to deal with them. We see that Moshiach comes on a path that includes adultery and incest, because remember, there is the story of Lot and sleeping with his two daughters, and eventually will produce Ruth, and prostitution and seduction. These are all part of this fascinating mix that Hashem cooks up in order to bring us one step closer to Geula. There's so much to think about and talk about here, but essentially the bottom line is that we're seeing in real time what people are going through and how they're going to deal with it. Yehuda obviously acts in less than a stellar fashion, but he comes out of it okay. At least he steps up and he admits that he was wrong, and that puts him on the path towards redemption after the incident with Yosef, where he really must have just run away thinking, how did I do that to my brother? And how did I do that to my father? Yosef, for his part, he has to also, and we've talked about this in another shiur, he has to grow up. And this is a big test. This test of his loyalty, both to his family and also to morality, because he says at some point, how can I sleep with this woman when I have been given such a new lease on life by Potiphar that he put me in charge of his house as a slave? I mean, I could have been killed. I could have gotten the worst possible situation, but I haven't. How can I repay what he's done for me by sleeping with his wife? So Yosef also this is a major turning point in his life, and he's rewarded by the fact that although he's thrown into prison, this is where he is going to ultimately find the path to becoming a higher up in Egypt, and eventually saving his family and paving the way for them to come to Egypt and eventually leave Egypt in the Geula that is known as Yetziat Mitzrayim. So these incidents are not just isolated incidents that happen to be part of the lives of these people, but they are formative in the sense that they show us, people are real. They have urges, desires, they have failings and weaknesses, but they also have the ability to rise above it and to, at some point, reach a higher moral ground. And then that will take them to the next step where they can hopefully reclaim their original stature and even become heroes and heroines. So we also have to see both sides, which we saw both of Tamar. Some would say that look what she did. She dressed up as a prostitute and she had relations with her father-in-law, and look at the wife of Potiphar. But they also had goodness within them, in particular Tamar, and they are instrumental in the formation of Jewish history. So we stop here. We went a couple of minutes over, and because we're not going to be getting together in the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned, and we'll be back again and hopefully everybody will be tuning in, and we'll keep you posted on the next session. So if anybody has a question or comment, you could unmute yourself for a couple of minutes and speak your piece. I think you should be all right. Hopefully, if you want to, you should be able to unmute if anybody wants to say anything. Yes, anybody out there?
Yeah, hello.
Yes.
I was going to say, I was thinking about these stories, and we often say that the Sefer Torah, the Torah is not a kosher book. It's not my thing. The whole idea of Christianity, where they are so, all comes from a virgin birth, because it's the antithesis of what we see in the Torah. We see, as you said, human beings with both good and bad, with failings. Mashiach came from not necessarily the purest origins. And yet, in a way, that's what makes it so much more compelling.
Yes, well, my only comment to that is, this is kind of what we're seeing almost with Yehuda trying, this excuse, when I read that medrash, excusing him. I mean, I know some people don't like when I do these ditties, but some of them, like John said to Mary, "You're the most, let's have a baby and blame it on the Holy Ghost." So, this is a similar idea that took place here.
But there's so
Yehuda,
many stories. There's David,
thinking that it must be proper to have a prostitute. But you can take that for what it's worth. And in the end, of course, Yehuda does not emerge unscathed from what he did, because clearly he did something that he really shouldn't have done. Okay, I just want to.
We see that, but we see people who, and maybe it's also the idea of teshuvah, that yes, you can make mistakes, you can fall, but you can make it better. And we see Yehuda as well with the sale of Yosef, which you may or may not be covering.
He came
how he redeems himself.
He came to the precipice and he did the right thing. Otherwise, yes, he would have been, obviously, he wouldn't have been the same person. And some people do. Most of the great people make mistakes. Certainly, David HaMelech, we know he made a major mistake of a sexual situation. And he bemoaned that every day of his life. All of the Tehillim that we're studying now, Tehillim, we see this in almost in half of the Tehillim, that he's bemoaning the fact that he made this mistake. Okay, anybody else want to comment? If not, then I will wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for tuning in. Yes, Hanukkah Sameach. It should be a very happy, bright holiday for everybody.
Have a safe.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip. See what you come. Interesting.